Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tracy Glab, Curator of Collections and Exhibitions, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Sheppy Dog Lecture at the Flint Institute of Arts with this virtual presentation by Dr. Michael Pytlik. And thank you for your flexibility at this last minute change from in-person to virtual, which we decided to do out of the abundance of caution. You can see behind me, I have a screenshot of our theater at the FIA, but I've heard that there are actually people there tonight. And so welcome to those who made it in person, and welcome to all of those who are tuning in via YouTube or Zoom. Thank you very much. The Sheppy Dog Fund was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to present speakers addressing the topics of art, religion, and history prior to the 19th century. Thank you, Dr. Klein, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the FIA. I know everyone will enjoy hearing tonight's presentation by Dr. Michael Pytlik. We look forward to joining you again on February 9th at 6 p.m. with a lecture by Andrew Lear on the Shady Ladies of the Metropolitan Museum. Please visit flintarts.org/lectures for more information, as well as recorded presentations of previous Sheppy Dog Fund lectures. And at this moment, it is planned to be in person, but that may change, so please check our website or social media. A quick word about this virtual program before I introduce our speaker. Though we are airing this via Zoom, audience members are muted and your cameras are turned off. If you would like to submit a question, please do so via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you are watching this on YouTube, you can enter your questions there as well. I'll be monitoring both places. For those of you who are in the audience tonight, feel free to use your phone to enter a question into the YouTube channel. That's probably the easiest way to enter a question. And the Q&A portion of this lecture will begin after the lecture. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speaker. Dr. Michael Pytlik is an adjunct professor in anthropology and religion and the director of Jewish studies at Oakland University. He has excavated a number of biblical and more recent sites in Israel and takes students from Oakland to Israel each year on excavations. Dr. Pytlik has a bachelor's degree in history and philosophy, a master in Jewish studies, and a doctorate in Jewish studies from Spertus College of Judaic Studies and Leadership, Chicago. His area of study is historical and theological questions relating to the early Israelite monarchy at the time of King David. He teaches courses in the archaeology of Israel, archaeology of sacred sites, Jewish history, theology, religion and culture, and world religions. I now turn this program over to Dr. Michael Pytlik. Thank you, Dr. Pytlik, for being here tonight and being flexible. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's a great joy to be here with you, and thank you for all your work and for the quick pivot to make this virtual. But I would like a chance in the future to come and speak in that wonderful auditorium. So that would be very nice. So thank you, Tracy, for everything. And thank you especially to Dr. Alan Klein for suggesting this and for supporting this wonderful lecture series. So I have not enough time to do what I want to do, so I'm going to get started, and we'll talk about the evidence that we have uncovered and the interpretations that we have made in association with Hebrew University of Jerusalem, including work we have done since 2009. Oakland University has joined Hebrew University, and the director of the excavations that we were part of, Dr. Yossi Garfinkel, who has a number of articles and books and things like this that you might want to check out if you're interested in this topic. I also want to thank our many, many donors in the greater Detroit area who allow our students to go on this wonderful experience in Israel for 12 consecutive years until COVID. And they have been instrumental in letting our students go at a very reasonable cost. So we want to say especially thank you to the Nina and Bernie Kent and all the other donors. So thank you for that. So I would like to show you what we have discovered in 3 different sites. And so the time will have to be used very wisely by me, and that is my challenge. So what I would like to talk about tonight is after 13 seasons of excavations, and that is 1 per year in a 6-week stint in the summers at 3 different sites. And we want to be able to put together a research. We did put together a research program to look at the 3 different sites with specific questions related to the biblical tradition on one hand, and what archaeology and history has to say on the other hand, pertaining to the early monarchy in Judah. So what I want to call your attention to is this very small area here, Judah. And the biblical tradition, to remind you, suggests that this area of Judah became a small kingdom first, before the northern kingdom of Israel. And then there was at some point a combining of these 2 kingdoms into what we call the United Monarchy. So the biblical story is a little bit different than what we've uncovered, but I think what we have uncovered has added to the story. So we'll take a look at some of these points. What constitutes a kingdom, and whatever the size of it? The Bible is pretty verbose and pretty exaggerates the size and extent of David's kingdom. For example, it says that David's kingdom reached from the Nile all the way to the Euphrates. That clearly was not the case. So there's some boasting there in the Bible, which is not too surprising. It was a small kingdom, and we'll show you what we have uncovered in that regard. Who are the people who lived at these sites? Because that matters. Who are the people in about the 10th century BC? That is roughly 1000 BC or so is our target date, roughly. Who was living in this area? Which different groups were there? And then what were the social, cultural, and historical, and even legendary factors pertaining to this early monarchy? And how does it support, or how does the archaeology challenge these issues, and so on? And also chronology, which in archaeology is the big thing. When did things happen, and can we prove those things, and how do we prove those things? So those are the things we want to look at tonight. So we'll take a quick look here at the biblical view of the monarchy. So this means when did a region, when did a city, when did a locality with a number of cities get to the point where it could call itself a monarchy? So there's some certain things we need to look for. Was there a center? What's the political periphery like? And so on and so forth. In the biblical view, the story goes something like this, though, that Saul, although considered to be sort of the first king of Israel, he was from the north. There's limited textual evidence about him creating a kingdom. The Bible doesn't tell us that he was able to really do this. He was more of a military leader, probably, controlled some regions or so, but he's not given credit in the stories for uniting all the tribes and creating a kingdom, northern or southern for that matter, although we tend to think of him as being sort of the first king, which may be true. Then there's the gap here in the center, which is David. And David, according to biblical chronology, based on how things all stack up time-wise, based on certain events before and after David, the Bible tells us that he should have lived somewhere around 1000 BC, based on the internal chronology of the Bible. Perhaps he was first known as a mercenary, a soldier of fortune who went into the service of Saul, and at times even went over, according to the Bible, went over to the Philistine side. And he was a really good politician as far as gaining support among various groups. Now, we have to think of a time when there really wasn't a kingdom. So how do you bridge north, south? How do you get people all together? And he was apparently quite good at that. The Egyptians kind of give a picture of the land at this time roughly as being sort of lawless. They talk about mercenaries, or what they call sashu or a piru. Maybe David was one of those kind of characters who was charismatic enough to gain support among his followers. And he won some battles against the Philistines, for example, or for Saul. in his army. And then he was eventually made king over Judah at Hebron, and that comes from 2 Samuel. And Hebron is in Judah. So he's made king there and then goes to Jerusalem. And then eventually after that, somehow there's another way that he was able to garner support with the northern tribes, intermarriages, negotiations, and so on, that he made a pact. He made a pact with the north and united north and south. And this is the sort of glorified kingdom united that we read about in the Hebrew Bible. There were at the time, there were numerous Philistine encounters. The Philistines were a group among the sea peoples who had landed in this region on the coastal plain of what is now modern Israel since around the 11th century BCE. And there are lots of stories about battles and lots of stories about locations of the Philistines. And there's lots of locations mentioned where the Israelite groups, including David and Saul, fought against the Philistines. And these are clues that we have to pick up and look at. There is a somewhat interesting story, a passage that says that David went over and into the service of one of the kings of the ancient city of Ziklag, of Gat. And this king Achash, who's the Philistine king, gave David a village of Ziklag for his services. So it raises the question whether David was a soldier of fortune, went on both sides, but he seems to have played everybody against each other, again, in a sort of a cunning way. So good politician, it seems. Over time, David had a steadily improved reputation, regardless of the facts, such as the David and Bathsheba story or the Uriah story. He had a good PR agency all through Jewish history. Which is interesting to trace, which I did for my dissertation. Then after David comes Solomon, who, according to the biblical view, expanded Jerusalem, fortified certain sites like Megiddo and Gezer and Lachish and others in Jerusalem, and expanded the territory. We're getting a little more of a clearer picture that this probably was the case, that Solomon was more interested in the welfare of the kingdom, less involved with trying to fight against the Philistines, because there doesn't seem to be any of that left over after David was done. So what should we expect from a kingdom if we're looking for one? Well, it depends on the size. We have to adjust our expectations of the size. But there should be a central place, a capital perhaps, or a compound of some sort. It doesn't have to be a grand city in order to control a larger area. But that place seems to be Hebron or Jerusalem, although the archaeology there is a bit mixed. Hebron, it's very not complete, very incomplete. But in Jerusalem, there's a lot of data to sift through. And I'll give you just a couple of clues about that. In Jerusalem, because it's urbanized, it's large, where do we look? That's one thing. And so there's been a lot of work about trying to find this evidence of the 10th century BC in Jerusalem, with some hit and miss. There's the city of David, of course, and some other excavations that have been done there. But was Jerusalem or Hebron the central? That wasn't our main focus. Our focus was to go out onto the periphery, next to where the Philistine areas were, because that's where there's easier ways to access the archaeology, and also to ask the questions, what was going on at the time. It's easier to dig there, for one thing, and less politically charged and so on. The periphery of the borders can maybe illustrate the vulnerable points where defense is going to be needed at the periphery, where the people are facing Israelites or Judeans versus Philistines, for example, and so on. So peripheries and borders are important. There must be some kind of administration or taxation or some kind of official way to deal with the business of the kingdom, whatever its size. And there should be fortified cities, for example, walls and gates, and some kind of which would signal us towards a administration of some sort. Literacy, is it necessary? Probably. There has to be some way to move information around, but that is hard to prove oftentimes because there are such a lack of texts or lack of inscriptions. But we have one from one of the sites. And then we have to look at the relevant text or historical references from outside, if possible. Did anybody else say there was a Solomon or a David or a Saul? Were there treaties involved? What did the Egyptians have to say, etc.? And then, are there any other historical references that we can cross reference to look at the evidence of kingdom? These are all the things we want to look at. So here's the overview of the last 13 seasons. And we were doing this in a regional approach. So from 2008 to 13, we dug at a small site called Khirbet Qeiyafa. We later identified that as a biblical site, and that does not occur very often, where we can name a biblical site. It was fortified. It was dated directly to this time period as being established around 1025 to 1000 BC. And it was a short-lived site within 40 to 50 to 60 years. And then it was destroyed and abandoned and never repopulated again until 700 years later. We excavated that site from 2008 to 13. Fascinating site, which we'll talk mostly about tonight. Then we went to Lachish to answer similar questions, 2014 to 17, a very difficult site to excavate, very large, a huge city. It was the second city to Jerusalem later in the Judean monarchy, and there we have more complete documentation. It was destroyed, for example, in a specific date, 701 BC, by the Assyrians, and then again in 586 BC, in a very important date, because then the Babylonians destroyed not only Lachish, but they went on to Jerusalem and destroyed it as well. So our research question was this, mostly. There were a couple of them, but this was the main one. Was it settled in the early Judean monarchy, meaning about 1000 BC? And who is responsible for this, if it was? Because previous expeditions to this site since 1930s did not address this question fully. So we were digging in new areas to try to answer that question. And then we got out of there because once we figured this out, we did not stay because this is a monumental site, which I'll show you. And then a site you've probably never heard about yet, but it's called Khirbet Arai. We dug there for 2.5 seasons roughly. And it was previously unexcavated and unknown. Nobody really knew its ancient name. Sometimes that's not super important to know, but what's important is what's in the ground. But we took a chance here to try to figure out if there is a regional association with these other sites and what's going on with this site and Philistine sites. And was this perhaps, and we said in 2019, we declared it to be the site of biblical Ziklag. As I told you just a minute ago, this is the site we think the king of Gat, a Philistine king, gave to David. Now, that's a pretty big boast to be able to say, but we had to have specific things that allowed us to say it. We just didn't announce it for this way. Now let's look at the first site. Khirbet Qeiyafa is simply the ruins of Qeiyafa in the Elah Valley. Now this site is here. You can see it in the red circle, perhaps a small faint outline. These are the city walls that are above ground from the later period. Now this is set here in this region of the Shephelah, which means it's the area between the central hills, the higher hills, and the coastal plain where the Philistines were. So there are biblical passages referring to the Elah Valley, and these include and mention David by name. So David seems to have been here, or stories about him, or given credit to, he's given credit for this period, locked into a time frame that reflects the reality of the 10th century. I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So we didn't know what this site was. The previous explorers, like the French and some Germans and some Americans who came by these areas in the 19th century, tried to understand what these old place names could be and were they biblical, for example. They came by this site, and it's amazing that no one excavated here until we came in 2008 and decided to make this a test case. And when we found a fortified evidence of fortifications and walls and the right pottery and the chronology and things, we decided to do a 10-year project. It turns out we wrapped that up in just about that, or a little less. There was a known site over here called Sokol, and one over here just off this picture called the Zeka. So between these sites, you could walk to all of them in probably a little less than an hour, perhaps. This is the Elah Valley, still a thoroughfare in modern Israel, but was a thoroughfare in ancient times. This valley went up to the Judean hills, to Hebron and Jerusalem. So this was an ancient thoroughfare. It was important to understand who's coming and going, because if you were to turn around from this picture and look the other direction, you would be looking at the Philistine region just the other side. Okay, so this is a very important location. The 5 major cities of the Philistine Confederation include Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gat. Gat is the closest place to the border with ancient Israel. So the border goes something like this. The Elah Valley goes up this way towards the interior. And the sites I just showed you, Soho and Azekah, are here. And you can see, even when this map was made in 2012, Khirbet Qeiyafa wasn't on the map yet, because nobody had identified the site yet at that point, or the maps weren't updated. But the site is roughly here. So this is Khirbet Qeiyafa. We have identified it as Biblical Sha'arayim, and I'll show you why that's the case. Okay. The 5 cities of the Philistine include these major cities, which were quite powerful in their day. When the Philistines first arrived, they arrived on the coastline here, and they pushed inward a bit. So we get this story reflected in the Bible about these interactions between this new people coming from the Aegean, the Philistines, or the sea peoples, and the interplay with the Judeans, who are themselves at around this point trying to become their own culture and defend their own little small kingdom at this point. To give you the sense of the principal cities that we think were important based on text and archaeology, is that Jerusalem is only a day's walk from Khirbet Qeiyafa. This is important, that its close proximity to what might have been the central place, like the palace location or something. And if it was Hebron, it was another day's walk in this direction, and then another day's walk roughly from Hebron to Jerusalem. So the communication could flow. So this might have been sort of the area of the beginning of the monarchy, but the crisis point would have been right here, because the Philistines were just a few miles away in this direction. So this site turned out to be one of those sites that probably was a border site, a fort of some sort. All right. So when did David live? The traditional biblical account, internal chronology that I mentioned, has Saul from around 1050 to 1007, and David ruled around 1000 BC. Solomon came in a bit later, 965 to 930, and the Bible tells us that they lived 40 years and so on. We can't take that at face value. It's just a good long reign. So the Iron Age is what we're talking about here. The Iron Age 2A runs from around 1000 BC to the end of Solomon's reign, so about 925 or so. This is the archaeological period. And what we should expect here is not necessarily to prove any particular ruler, but we want to look for certain kinds of evidence: state structure, administration, and certain political, geopolitical things. Now, how do we know in archaeology when this city was in existence? Here we have one of the first selections that we were able to grasp, which was these small olive pits, which were charred and were in a sealed context in the city drain. And these are one of the first carbon-14 samples we were able to draw. And it turns out that they were dated right around, on average, right around 1000 BC. Now, this does not prove David specifically, but it does prove that this site was in existence at about 1000 BC, which fits all of the internal stories and the chronology and so forth. Now, the other anchor that we have, a very important piece of evidence, is that if Israel is first known from the Egyptians on an Egyptian document that says that Israel existed somewhere around 1206 BC already as a people, then there's a kingdom formation period here. And then in 835 BC, this document was found written by a king from Damascus outside the Bible. And there he claims he won a victory against the house of David. So David is here mentioned specifically outside the Bible for the first time. There might be one other source, but the question is, this is about 150 years after David should have lived. So what we want to do is look back in time, 150 years, and what was going on then. Well, that's what we were trying to find out with this regional approach with different sites. So Khirbet Qeiyafa, southwest of Jerusalem, and just south of the modern town of Bet Shemesh in the Judean low foothills. You can see the site after it's been excavated. We excavated about 27% of this site, which is quite a lot considering most sites are excavated between 1 and 10%. We were able to move pretty quickly because it's relatively shallow. Right under the ground, right under the surface, we started to find evidence already back to the Iron Age. So one of the first things was found was these large monumental stones. And then other stones were blocked in a later period. The later period is the Greek age, about 700 years after the site sat unoccupied after it was destroyed in about 960 or so BC. 700 years later or so, the site was occupied by a different group, which had different building techniques. They filled in the wall, and we were able to, see the different sorts of building stones that they used. And we were able to take this off, and what we were able to find was we had a beautiful gatehouse. So there's some of these stones are 9 to 10 tons, 6 to 10 tons in some cases. And once the rubble was taken off and we were down to the bedrock of the city in the Iron Age in 1000 BC, we had a beautiful city wall complex. Now, these are just the foundations. They would have been several stories high. And you can see here the thoroughfare coming into the city with these recessed gates areas here, a threshold stone. There would have been doors to close the city gate. And this is looking out towards the Philistine area across the valley. So the site was erected at about 1000 BC in one go. There are no phases or no improvements to the site that we could detect. And then after about 40 years or so, it was destroyed. Why was it destroyed? We think it was just a border fort. The borders were changing and it was destroyed purposefully. So here Yossi Garfinkel is giving a tour like he does all the time, showing us the threshold stone. This one threshold stone is at the gate entrance, which would have had a lip to hold the doors. And it was one piece of stone. We estimate it was 10 tons. That's quite a thing. That itself shows us there must have been some kind of administration to be able to have the technology to create such big stonework and to move those stones. So here we are digging on virgin soil for the first time and heading down looking for more evidence. As we went to the other side of the site, we started in area B, found the city gate, and then the next year when Oakland joined the party, we went to area C to answer a question: was there a second gate? And as it turns out, we found out similar situation, large stones, rubble filled it in. We took this off, got down to the original, and we found that we had two identical city gates, both built at the same time. And this was an important clue. This city in its time was only about 6 acres, maybe had 400 or 500 people at its height living there, Judeans. The question is, why were there 2 city gates when this is a vulnerable place in a city that you have to protect, that you have to guard, etc. And so this was quite odd. Why were there 2 gates? Now, here's an important clue to the identity of the city: 2 gates or multiple gates, because it's so unusual. Now, Sha'arayim is mentioned several times in the Bible, and nobody knew where it was. We had a clue, but we weren't sure until we found things like this, the second gate. It's mentioned in the book of Joshua as a city belonging to Judah, and any other time it's mentioned in the Bible, it's mentioned with David. So we have to look at the biblical clues when they're helpful, and if they're not helpful, we have to take that into account too. So Sha'arayim, what does it mean in Hebrew? In Hebrew, it's read Sha'ar or Sha'arayim. So this is a gate or gates. The plural is here. So this is Sha'ar or Sha'arayim, which means 2 gates or gates, plural. This is the only time that this reference is used in this way in the Hebrew Bible. and double gates are unknown in any other site in this period. And all of this is locked into not only the textual tradition to the 10th century BC, associated with one king, that's David, and the archaeology supports this. So we had to date these things very carefully. And what was nice for us, for this site anyway, is that it was built in one go. It existed for a period of time, a short period of time, and then it was destroyed and sealed. So everything that we uncovered after 700 years of or more of no occupation, we were able to have a sealed city, which means everything inside of it was like a picture was taken at the end. Now, a biblical city is not easy to determine. So, for example, in Joshua, there's a cities list, like there are many cities lists in the Hebrew Bible, Eshtaol and Zorah and so on and so forth. And then we have these sites, Socho, Azekah, which I showed you, which we knew where they were, and Sha'arayim and these others. Some of these have been found and identified, others have not. But we might assume that the writer was writing towns in association with other sites. We knew where Socho and Azekah was because those were named and found. Sha'arayim seemed to fit that situation. Now in the Hebrew text, it says in the David and Goliath scene, David ran over and stood over the Philistine, meaning Goliath. He took his sword and killed him, cut off his head. When the Philistines saw what had happened, they ran away. They chased the Philistines to the valley and the very gates of Ekron. The Philistine corpses lay fallen along the road from Sha'arayim to Gat and Ekron. So in other words, this story, whether it's legendary, partially historic, doesn't really matter. What's interesting is the association that they give, the clues they embed in the text. So even if the biblical writer was writing much later, he or she, most likely he, I guess at this time, was telling about the setting. And so Sha'arayim is here mentioned. Like I said, Sha'arayim is only mentioned in association with David or belonging to Judah, never the Philistines or the Canaanites or anybody else. So in order for this site to make sense, historically, it's got to match up. It's got to match up with the chronology. We were able to prove that with numerous olive pits and carbon-14 dates and pottery chronology. Now, there was war with this because this is probably a legendary story. So in 2 Samuel, there was another war with the Philistines, and Elchanan, the son of Oragim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite. Now, here Elchanan is given credit in another part of the Bible, but in another part, there seems to have been a scribal error where the brother of was omitted. Now, one theory is that the scribe made a mistake and the Hebrew word phrase for the brother of was miswritten, which changed the grammar of the sentence, giving the credit for this deed to Elchanan. But the point is that in Chronicles later on and in other parts of the Bible, David is given credit for it and other parts of Jewish tradition. Now, David was given credit for something that this Elchanan did. Now, according to this theory by Joel Baden and others, who wrote this book relatively recently, The Historical David, the real life of an invented hero. He says, we don't need all this archaeology stuff because the text provides enough information that David had a very good PR agent. In other words, even if David didn't do this, he was given credit for it. That's part of the situation we have to look at with David, is that he had a very easy pass through Jewish history, that all of his sins were forgiven over time. Another thing that we found at Khirbet Qeiyafa quite early, 2008, which was earth-shattering at the time, was the largest, now the longest Proto-Hebrew inscription ever found. It was found in a house. This inscription is this piece of pottery here, and on it, written 5 lines of text. Here's some of it. And it was dated to, the pottery itself is dated to about 1000 BC, so it fits. The inscription was generously, understand this is a generous translation, not everybody agrees, but it says something like this: do not do it, but worship, judge the slave and the widow, plead for the infant, plead for the poor, etc., etc. This turns out to be, if this is, putting some flesh on the meager bones that we have here, because not everyone agrees, we have a sort of a prophetic text. It's not just a list of commodities, for example. Now, if you were to compare this to Isaiah 1, which was written quite a bit later, it reads sort of the same way. to help the oppressed, defend the orphan, and plead for the widow. So it could be that this is an early form of prophetic writing that tells us to, be good people, take care of the poor, and etc. Now, the one thing that really does stand out here is that this is the epigrapher for the site. And just by what we think we know of this text, it says al ta'as and then do something else. In grammatic form, al ta'as is the do not do imperative verb that does not appear in Phoenician or Canaanite or anything else. This is a Hebrew form. So we have a Proto-Hebrew script. This added to the data that we would be able to say that these people here were Judeans writing already in Proto-Hebrew script, so in the Canaanite dialect. So what we have here is another piece of evidence that goes towards the site identification. From 2010 on to 2013, we dug more and more of the site. We started to find unique Judean architecture. Here is the city wall, outside the city wall, and these are called casemates. These L-shaped pieces that are found, and these are houses attached to the city wall on the inside of the city wall. This is a room. There are multiple rooms to each house. This is the casemate here, which allows the house to be abutted right next to the city wall, and also to have open space for storage or for troops to come in and defend the walls, or a combination of that, public and private space. As it turns out, this unique Judean architectural feature is found only in Judah. So it's the case that houses were built up towards the city walls in other places, like for the Canaanites and the Philistines, but they were not attached to the wall. This seems to be a unique Judean architectural feature that will remain within the Judean culture for hundreds and hundreds of years. Of course, pottery is ubiquitous at the site, and it allows us to, the retrieval of the pottery allows us to date the materials carefully. And we analyze all of these things. They are registered every day on the site. And in fact, the floors of each house were littered with materials. Now, we were able to make a determination that the site was destroyed purposefully because it was a lightning event, apparently. The people were not able to take out most of the stuff in their house. In fact, every house was jammed with stuff, what we call restorable pottery, on the floor of the house, which means the pottery may have been in pieces, but it was restorable, meaning that whatever smashed down on top of it, like walls or ceilings or whatever, kept everything in place. You can see here, this is a cleaned up version of just one of the rooms in one of the houses, just full with pottery, handles and rims and body pieces of pottery and bases over here and rubble. So we could see that the people were not able to get out, to get the things out. Now, we did not find any human remains in the site. There were a number of other places in the site that were converted to temples, cult rooms. Here is one drawing of this room. These were houses that were converted, house rooms that were converted to cult rooms. And at Khirbet Qeiyafa, we have 3 of them, which is an interesting thing because the Bible says, in association with David, that he took the Ark of the Covenant from a house and brought it and put it in a house in Jerusalem before the temple was built. Here is another example of how the people were using their materials. They were hiding metals inside of pottery storage, and they did not retrieve them out. So we found weapons like swords and threshing materials and iron hooks and other things hidden inside pottery, and it was there for us to find. And beautiful, in some cases, intact chalices, which were used for cultic activity, for perhaps sharing wine or offerings or whatever it was happened to be. And in this case, we found beautiful pieces that were 100% intact because they were preserved. This allowed us to empty the contents, and we were able to get more samples for carbon-14 dating from the site. So it was quite secure. This site offers us a glimpse into early Judean practices, including not only diet. For instance, we found no pork bones here at all. But if we go over to the Philistine side of things and look at their sites, they have a diet that consisted of between 18 and 23%, perhaps, or thereabouts, of pork. Now, that's not a make or break whether this site is Judean, meaning proto-Jewish, but it seems that the prohibition against eating certain animals like pigs was already in place. This is a piazza that was found near the city gate. Here's the gate. And you could walk into the city and, conduct, trade and sell materials, and, maybe there are ceremonies and things like this here. This is quite a sophisticated city for its time. One of the first fortified cities that we know of in Judah. Again, here's this full pot. Chalices were found in this area. Now I want to show you some interesting things here. This room just near the city gate was converted to a ritual cultic place. Very interesting because it's right off of the piazza, where whatever kind of religious activities were going on, people could be part of that or be nearby it. This was a house. It was converted to a cultic room. How do we know it's cultic? We found some sort of bizarre, unique things that are not mentioned in the Bible. So a libation vessel was found here smashed in this part of the room. Little, what we call God boxes, were found here. Little small temple models that we found. Incense altars with unique stone, not native to this area, but brought in from somewhere else. And so there's been a lot made about these God boxes, meaning that they may have been sort of proto-visual representations of what the temple in Jerusalem would look like later, because it's not built yet. So this is an interesting thing. Here we want to point out that we have recessed doors. This is mentioned in 1 Kings when the description about the temple, which will come in the future, 50 to 60 years, that's what they will do. So this might be an echo or sort of a prelude, little miniature boxes of what the temple facade looked like. Up here at the top, we have a number of small little notches here that turn out to be beams that would run inside the building, also mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Here's the God box that was smashed purposely in place, probably by whoever conquered the city. And then here's the other small God box we didn't find any statues associated with this, or they were stolen, or they were destroyed completely. But that is an interesting thing. So we're learning a lot here about the cultic practices of the early Judeans. I'm going to skip this part here, but I'm going to just show you that these tied beams here are implicated here in this God box, but they also appear on places like another place for sure, the Parthenon. This idea that we have beams put together and they run inside the building to keep its support. Recessed doors are well known in the ancient Near East, and recessed doors were found here. This is an indication that we have a temple sort of precinct. Solomon's Temple and Palace is a book that is all about this and gives lots of details if you're interested in picking that up. Recessed doors are also known in Christian history, like here at a cathedral in southern France. So at the end, this site was a beautiful representation of, for the first time, that we have a unique picture of a Judean fortified town with literacy, at least for some, relations with the Philistines nearby. And as it turns out, there was a model made of it. The western gate might have looked like this, the southern gate, and then the administration building, which I did not talk about, but was the largest Iron Age building ever found. Unfortunately, it was cut into by later occupation at the site, and all we know about it is about 30 meters long and at least that much wide. So we have a lot of things here from this site. The absolute dates for this are confirmed at about 1000 BC, and it was destroyed. It went into effect before it went into construction. Too late for Saul and too early for Solomon. That leaves one king. All of their associations with the name in the Hebrew Bible are associated with David in this location. Not a single pork bone. It's not a Philistine site, not an Egyptian site or a Canaanite site. So we have a lot of information to share here. The next little site I want to talk about, we'll have a few more minutes. I know I'm going over just a little bit, but I think we'll have time, is Khirbet Arai, which is northwest of a major city, Lachish. Okay. This site was a bit of a gamble, because it had never been excavated. In fact, we weren't 100% sure there was much there, except there were some obtrusions above ground. So we did some flyovers and we did some testing, and we found, yep, there's architecture here. So in 2018, we did a full season, and it's a beautiful setting. There are some rubble above ground, but a lot of times farmers or sheep herds will take the stones and sort of make corrals. So you can't go by this. We had to get under the ground. So this is the highway going towards Lachish, and this is important for the regional approach. So after the first year of excavation, we put up a drone to take pictures, and we had a series of squares put here and here, and they all dated exactly right around the same time as Khirbet Qeiyafa. So this site might have been in operation at that same time. And did it have the same materials? As it turned out, the pottery is the same. The ethnic attribute must be about the same. Now, we didn't know the name of this site in ancient times. Was it in the Bible? Was it not? But we had enough information that in 2018 through 19, we started up here at the top of the site. We weren't sure if we were going to find anything. As it turned out, within a few hours, we started to find monumental architecture. And you can see the surface level here, just below the surface, there's this monumental walls and huge stones, taking 3, 4, 5 people to move even one of them. That was a lot of work. And once we moved the materials out, we were able to see a sequence that was very interesting. So the Judean occupation here, meaning the Judean culture, there were several layers that were full of Canaanite material. And then above that, the Philistines came in, and they occupied the site for a period of time, over a century. Now, this is important because we need to know who lived here in order to make the claim that we did. The biblical tradition places Ziklag, the city of Ziklag, in the control of one king. That's King Lachish of Gat, according to the Bible. So our settlement occupation included this. Once we unrolled everything, it was Canaanite, older, then Philistine came in, then the Israelites or the Judeans came in. And it seems for a time, the Philistines and the Israelites or the Judeans lived sort of together. And then it became completely Judean, meaning no pork bones after that. The pottery changed over. And so it went and changed hands. It was Philistine for a while, and then it was Judean, which is an interesting thing that matches the occupation, the geopolitical situation of the 10th century, and the references. All references to Ziklag are with David and Gat and specific sites. There's only one tradition mentioning one king associated with this site, and that's David. So we were able to really find some impressive ruins here. If you want to look closer into David's history, look at this book by Baruch Halpern, David's Secret Demons, and you can see his tagline here is Messiah, Murderer, Traitor, King. Again, this idea that David had a pretty interesting, colorful career. He may have gone over to the king of Philistines to sort of, in the end, turn the tables on the Philistines. But for a while anyway, seems to have been a traitor towards Judah. It's a very interesting thing. So we need to know, to identify a site, its textual traditions, its history, and the archaeology has to give us the data to support any of that stuff. Or we need to tell a new story, or we need to move on. As it turns out, in the end, we had a site that was really well situated to reflect the biblical story, that it was shifting hands. It went from Philistine over to the Judeans, and the references all place David with this particular site. And David is the only king that is associated with this site. 15 times in 12 verses in the Hebrew Bible, all are associated with David. So there has to be a number of things add up. And that is that the occupation for this particular site was Philistine, then Judean. And it's very possible that, as it turns out, we were able to declare that this site was biblical Ziklag. One other site, just a few minutes more, I promise. We excavated from 13 to 17. This was a very difficult site. It's very big, 31 acres. Where do you begin? As it turned out, we started to excavate in this northeastern corner. There were some known features here from previous excavations. This is a platform for a palace from the Judean monarchy. As it turned out, we wanted to find out when was this site excavated, or when was this site fortified? There's a theory, but no evidence that David fortified this site. The Bible says in Chronicles 15 that Solomon's son fortified this site, Rehoboam. And it's possible that there are a number of different options that we could have chosen here. But how do we determine a date for city walls? First of all, the walls don't come dated by themselves. We need something associated with the wall to date it. So there has to be a floor attached to a wall. And inside that floor, there has to be something we can date to date the features, the walls, the floors, etc. And that happens to be pottery in this case. So pottery is a very crucial factor in all excavations. We found a temple from the late Bronze Age. We didn't mean to, we didn't necessarily want to, because we were looking for one question. This could be a career killer, this site. It's monumental. It's hard to dig there. It's high up in the air. It takes a lot of people to dig a small area, but even when we started poking around to try to find the walls, where are the walls? Nobody knew in the previous expeditions. We started to find stuff right away, and it wasn't exactly what we wanted, but once you start, you can't just stop. So we found a temple, and it was a wonderful temple, filled with statues of Baal and all kinds of figurines and from the Canaanite tradition, not the Judean, including weapons and ceremonial items, a burnt box full of grain. Doesn't look like much, but this was a big wooden box. As it turned out, we had a beautiful late Bronze Age temple, which was too early for us, but we had to dig it. It took us 2 years to dig this. And in the end, we covered it all up because we had to move on. This is a Canaanite temple. As it turns out, we had a sequence of walls that we spent 3 seasons uncovering. The first one down here is older. The next one is a bit more recent. The third one was new. Nobody said that had evidence that confirming or denying whether it was David, Solomon, or Solomon's son Rehoboam who fortified this site. And here's a more recent, the most recent wall. And here's the park, National Park walkway. And here's our tent where we do our breaks. As it turns out, this is a lot of work, really a lot of work. And we had one small area that allowed us to date the wall. The wall that was new for us and for everyone in the world was this one, and nobody knew about it before. Now, this is a confusing piece. The only thing I want to show you here is that this is the new wall that we found, a very substantial wall. And the only small surface associated with this wall was this piece right here. We were running out of time, and we had to find something to date on this very small piece. As it turns out, that's what you're looking into. And so the city wall is here we assumed from the 10th century. The surface of this small piece that we found associated with this wall, like I told you earlier, there were olive pits, luckily, on the floor. Luckily, people threw their olive pits when they ate them on the floor, and they were there. And guess what? It turned out to be 920 to 890. It's too late for David, and that's okay. It is, though, confirming 2 Chronicles 11 that Rehoboam fortified the site, but it's still part of the Judean kingdom. So what we were able to do is make some assumptions here based on all the stuff that we found. A fort, nobody knew about, another Canaanite temple, a gate complex, a ceremonial area, another palace up here, all kinds of information that we found, another city gate coming in from the valley, and so on. This was a tough site. I was glad to move away. So here's the summary of the sequence of the early Judean monarchy. In the early 10th century, Khirbet Qeiyafa was fortified, protected the interior, which we assume was Jerusalem or Hebron, or maybe somewhere else. And it was built during the height of the Philistine power opposite Gat. And the hero of this story, and all the references in the Hebrew Bible, the latent memories in the Hebrew Bible, are pointing to one guy, and that's David. So it's pretty clear, based on the Tel Dan inscription, that David was a real person. Most everybody believes that part. Now, is Khirbet Qeiyafa 100% accepted in the archaeological world for all of its interpretations? No, but nothing is in Israel. We're sticking with this. Lachish was a small site at the time of Khirbet Qeiyafa, but it was later fortified, which we now proved for the first time. And then after Lachish, this site was destroyed in a firm date in 1130 BC. The population there seems to have moved over across the valley to this place we now call Khirbet Arai or Ziklag. because it contains the occupation sequence: Canaanites, Philistines, Judeans, and the biblical references all point to David in this case. So the process of urbanization then transferred back to Jerusalem and Lachish over in later times. The biblical text suggests, and extra biblical references support the idea there was a King David and he did certain things. Now, whether we can believe the Goliath story wholesale, probably not, but it does have some latent memories there. Lachish and Jerusalem are well documented in later periods. So these other sites being on the periphery are very important to the story of the process of the small start of the Judean Empire, or empire of kingdom. And next year, to get us some more information from Jerusalem, we will be digging for the first time in Jerusalem, which is extremely exciting. So I assume, based on our previous successes and the real intuitive know-how of Yossi Garfinkel, that he has a site picked out. He hasn't even told us where it is in Jerusalem, but I'm extremely excited. And so even more so excited for the pandemic to allow us to go. So there you are, hurried as it is. When we have time for a in-person, something a little bit more specific, we'll do that. But here's some references, plenty of them out there. There are also people who are against these ideas, which is important to understand as well. So for now, I want to say thank you and take any questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pytlik, for such a fascinating talk. And there's definitely a lot to unpack with everything you've just talked about. And so we do have time for questions. And if anyone has, there is one I see right now coming in through YouTube. It's from Michelle. And the question is, Professor, what was your favorite archaeological discovery during your time in Israel?
I think, as I showed you some pictures, our first year going to dig at Khirbet Qeiyafa was 2009. And it was the first time I led a group of students there. In 2008, I had come back from Israel and came home and saw the news that an inscription had been found at this obscure place called Khirbet Qeiyafa. And I read it and I said, I want to go there next year. I want to be part of that. That's what got me interested. But when we got there, they were passing out sort of jobs for the groups. Who wants to go over there and continue what you did last year? Who wants to go over here? Whatever. And the option came, who wants to go dig up a potential second gate to prove this story about the two gates scenario? And I volunteered right away, and no one else did. And I thought, why is no one else volunteering for this? This is going to sort of define what we're doing. And as it turned out, within 2 weeks, we had confirmed we had a second gate, which really changed the story greatly. Now, it's not that exciting of a find, but because it's just a gate, but as it turns out, what it meant, its meaning was quite important. So that was really exciting and fulfilling. A lot of work and a lot of sweat in that. And the other one I'd have to say was I was digging a site that was from about 2000 BC. When I was a student still, and we were digging in the south, and it was unrelated to what I've talked about tonight, but we found a very sort of poignant moment in the debris where we found a woman, an adult, who had her arms around two infants, infants based on their skulls and things like this, and a whole jumble of material around them. It looked like it was either a collapse of a wall, didn't look like a burial. So we just sort of stood there and wondered what happened there. And, to see the mother still clutching the two, infant skulls, bodies was really powerful. I guess that's not Indiana Jones stuff, but.
Wow. So those wonderful objects you showed, the vase and the god boxes, where do those objects end up, and how can people see them?
Okay, we would love, because we were part of this for so long, we would love to be able to attract the artifacts here. And if we did, it would be a big deal. It's a lot of work and, you know, a lot of red hoops to get, big hoops to get through. But this was on display. The full display was at the Bible Ants Museum, which is right across the street, basically, from the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. This traveling exhibit, though, in the footsteps of King David, came to Washington, D.C., and it came to a few other places here in the States. It's not here now, but you can see it online partially through the Israel Museum, because that's where all this stuff is now. And maybe one day at Oakland University. Let's see if we can do that.
Are there any other questions? I don't have any coming in on the Q&A or YouTube, but feel free. We have a few more minutes. So if anyone has any burning questions, please.
And maybe while people are thinking of those, because we went so quickly, those God boxes that I was talking about, it's a hard thing to sort of summarize quickly, but those were smaller representations, the recessed doors and the little beams up on top. The important thing here is that the Hebrew Bible gives in First Kings a very rich description of what the temple looked like in Jerusalem under Solomon. He built the temple, apparently. We don't have any archaeological evidence of the first temple or the second temple. We have a lot of references, and even the Romans, you know, talked about the temple and blah, blah, blah. But we don't have any evidence of what the thing looked like, except from the Hebrew Bible description of it. And it's very detailed. The doors were like this and the beams were like this. In that description, there are a few terms there that we really didn't understand what the Hebrew was, because it was so specific to an event and in a building that doesn't exist. So we really didn't know quite how to read it. So there's a way to go back through and see all the various translations throughout history of these texts. And they're like, not anything related to, they're not consistent, okay? But we don't know. We had to take face value of the Hebrew text. And as it turns out, these God boxes have some clues embedded in them that allows us to maybe for the first time retranslate some of those specific words, like those beams that later will show up in places like the Parthenon and other ways. They're beams that go into the building. And so here we have captured in this little God box from about 50 years before the temple was theoretically built, that maybe the archaeology at Khirbet Qeiyafa is showing us some of the iconography that will later appear in the temple. And it's a very interesting sort of thing with the recessed doors and all that. There's a lot of recessed doors throughout history in temples and locations, including in our own country. You go into certain religious buildings, you have those recessed doors. It's try to bring you into a new reality. So you have these miniature boxes that are just fascinating on themselves, and worthy of books on their own. So,
all right, we have some questions coming in through YouTube. Jeremy asks, for someone unfamiliar with archaeology and its process, why do you cover up a site after you excavate it?
This was the big disappointment, because we had spent 2 seasons digging that temple. And we extracted the materials from it. We went right down to the core. We figured out when it was built, when it was destroyed, who destroyed it, all that business we were able to answer. But the problem is if you leave a site like that open in a national park, which is frequented by people who come up there and hike, and you don't have proper signage and you don't have proper security and so on and so forth, it's a danger. So as it turns out, once we got the information that we needed out of it, we covered it back up basically for that reason. And even if you have a site, like I showed you that picture, it's brief, but you have a picture of a few walls here and there, if you don't have any explanation for it, for people to see what was there, they can't see what came out of it. So they didn't see the little statues of Baal and the gold flake stuff we found and the bronze materials and the weapons and all that other stuff. All that stuff is out in the museum. So it just becomes sort of a security issue that people could fall in, hurt themselves, or do damage to it or whatever. So a lot of times things will be covered up. Another thing that we tried to find was the water source on top of the tell, and we could not figure out where they got the water except down in the valley, but that didn't seem efficient. So we were digging around looking for evidence of a big monumental well system like there are in other sites in Israel. And we dug a lot of big holes with backhoes and stuff like that, and sonar and all kinds of other things that we never found it, but we had to cover those in because they were quite deep. Now, Israel has declared Lachish and Khirbet Qeiyafa national historical parks. So they will give the funding and the signage for these sites now, which will be and proper roadway access and so on. So it's a very good thing. But in some cases, we do cover things up. And it's a disappointment after all the work that we do.
I can only imagine. So James from the Zoom is asking or commenting and asking a question. We've seen many debates over the use of the Bible as an archaeological tool. How significant was the find of Qeiyafa? I probably said that wrong, sorry.
Okay.
To disprove the theory, for instance, of Israel being the first kingdom instead of Judah, as the Bible says. And has this find caused any of the significant figures against the Bible as archaeological tool to convert?
Well, it depends on where you're digging and what your agenda is. There's a lot of archaeologists who dig in the north, for example, who claim that was the kingdom that came first because they're invested in that area. And there are people in the south who say, well, Jerusalem is the center and, the kingdom came first there. But the biblical tradition does say David was made king over Judah first in Bethlehem. He stayed at Hebron and ruled there for 7 years, according to the text, then went to Jerusalem. Then through intermarriages and, political alliances with the north, he was able to apparently combine these two. And it was only through, frankly, civil wars, marriage alliances, and David's cunning ability to work his charisma with various groups that allowed them to come together. Now, Solomon continued that united monarchy business, but after Solomon died, it split again. And north and south split, and they both had same culture and everything, but they had sort of different historical trajectories. It kind of is how you look at this, and I'm sure that's James Schofield's question. So it's a very good one, of course. And he's coming to Israel with us, hopefully this year. And in any event, I think we're safe to say on the archaeology, from my perspective and my bias, that Judah came first. Now, if you read Israel Finkelstein and other people, they will say, nope, the other way around. So you can sort of take your pick.
And there's another question on YouTube from Kelly. Are any of these finds and I think you might have answered this, but we'll just ask it anyway. Are any of these finds at the Israeli Antiquities Authority possibly online? So can we find these online, these finds?
I would look at the Israel Museum and look at their virtual offerings there. Also look at the Bible Lands Museum. They had this exhibit, a really nice exhibit. So they may have some, vintage, it was only a couple of years ago, but they may have some, catalog things there. And if not, send me an email. I'll do my best to help you out. It's Pytlik, Pytlik at oakland.edu. And there are a couple books out. In fact, there is a sort of an exhibition book / catalog called In the Footsteps of King David by Garfinkel. It's on Amazon.
And Tim asks on YouTube, does the presence of Canaanite idols prior to Judean occupation speak at all to the scriptures in which the Israelites are told to destroy any Baals or other idols when they occupy a new place?
One of the first characters we met at Lachish digging in 2014, and we were digging we didn't know we had a temple. We were digging carefully around the national park walkway because we didn't have permission yet to move that until we found out we had a temple sitting directly under the national park walkway. And we found a statue of Baal within the first few days. And then we realized, oh, maybe we have a Holy of Holies here, whatever. As it turned out, there were two of those statues and ceremonial things and wonderful Canaanite materials. an Asherah, a female deity and all this sort of thing. We found a number of those things. But what we don't know in that case who sort of got rid of or destroyed a certain artifact. So the history at Lachish, for example, is that it was destroyed about 1130, and we think it was the Philistines who may have done that. So in most cases, when a group comes in, like at Khirbet Qeiyafa, the god boxes and everything were smashed on purpose. And we can usually tell that they were smashed in place and not removed. That was sort of desacralizing those materials when you break them up. And in the ancient world, at least in the ancient Near East, when an army conquered a city and destroyed a temple, it was virtually saying, we've destroyed your God. So there is that. But as far as the Judeans and the Israelites doing that, yes, there's a rich textual traditions about don't do what those guys were doing, get rid of those idols and all that stuff. But we know for sure that it took a long time for that to actually happen, even among Judeans. So there are, in some cases, in Judean cities or houses, to hedge their bets, perhaps, there are Asherah, little female deities, fertility goddesses, in what would otherwise be considered to be a Judean house, until roughly into the 6th century after the Babylonian exile, when they come back, and then we don't see that stuff anymore. So monotheism does not happen overnight. And then we'd have to define what exactly that means anyway. But Asherah, Baal, El, all of these figures are locked into the Hebrew Bible because they were locked into the culture of the Canaanite tradition. And they're in the Hebrew Bible because it takes a long time to, get them out and bring in a new idea that is, Yahweh, whose other name, one of his names, by the way, is Elohim. El is an echo from the Canaanite past. So it doesn't happen overnight. But as far as intentional destruction of older deities, we've seen this even at Lachish. It's an interesting thing. At another part of the site, we did not dig there, but some of our colleagues did. In the gate system, at Lachish, they found in the gate, those chambers, in a different period, a later period, they found that there was probably a small temple inside the city gate, which is not unusual. And it was in the Judean sphere. Now, the Assyrians were coming in, and then there were some reforms that apparently were being made by Hezekiah, and they were trying to get the covenant right. And so the idea was to make Jerusalem the center, and the temple was the only place. And so they were supposed to close down the rural sites. So we've seen a couple examples of this, and only just recently at Lachish, where they closed down one of those little satellite sites, probably to great dissatisfaction of the locals who used it or whatever. And what they did there, it appears, is they turned it into a latrine. They put in a toilet seat. Now that will immediately desacralize the whole thing, pretty with an exclamation point. Whether it was used or not, just the mere presence of that, it was uncovered. We saw it coming out of the ground. And then we dug around in there and we found out that this was an altar. Altars were there and everything else in the Judean sphere. So even within the Judean context, and another site in Arad was a similar situation, close down all those rural places and make Jerusalem the center. And that's Deuteronomy that talks mostly about that sort of thing. But we have evidence now where, whether intentionally, peacefully, or destruction to get rid of the old ways is unfortunately pretty common.
A question from Jeremy on YouTube says, you excavated about 20% of a site. Is it typically fruitful to excavate more, or is 20%, which you said was a lot, supposed to be indicative of the rest of the site?
Well, that's the thing with Khirbet Qeiyafa. In the year 2012, we started to say, we have enough here. We've made our points. We know it's a Judean site. We found 2 gates. We've identified the site. Let's finish up a few things this year. We'll do 1 project into 13 and we'll cut it back and we'll finish. Well, in the 2012 and 2013, what we did, it was kind of like an oval shaped city. We went and put some probes into other places around the site. without doing massive excavation, like 1 square. We went down and we said, yeah, we have the same sort of thing here. We went over here. Yes, the whole place must have been populated with houses. We decided, I think it was about 27% of the site was excavated. And we decided, we need to stop. We need to assess this stuff and publish it and analyze it and all this stuff. And we also need to leave room for the future, meaning for better techniques, different questions, or for someone else to come in and say, we're looking for something else and we're going to dig where they didn't dig, but we left it. So that's part of the reason why. Most people probably don't realize this, but the excavation part is just one piece of the project. So for every season, 4 to 6 weeks of excavation, you're looking at 4 to 5 years of research and lab work and reconstruction and interpretations and publications. There are some sites that were excavated in Israel in the 1970s that are still not published yet. So publishing is very important. And this particular site, it's an imperative. It's right from the start. The fastest we can publish, accurately is the most important. So to this point, Khirbet Qeiyafa has 5 excavation reports out and numerous articles and so on. So it's important to get the word out to the people, especially when it's also sensationalized. We found a city of David. We found a biblical city. This is all, great stuff for the world. And so the BBC was there and National Geographic was there. And when we declared Khirbet Arai, ancient Ziklag in 2019, it was like, going to the UN to see a press conference. It was cameras everywhere from all over the world. Amazing. It's exciting.
I can only imagine. So we're out of questions and we're about out of time. So I would like to thank you again for your fascinating talk. And it's as a reminder to the people that are still watching that this is recorded and will be available on the Flint Institute of Art's YouTube channel, as well as other previous Sheppy Dog Fund lectures. So thank you, Dr. Pytlik, and thank you, Dr. Klein, for sponsoring this series. And thank you, everyone, for attending. We have a good evening.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you.